let me congratulate you. It's what Matt didn't mention is that I'm no longer formally a Pittsburgh resident. I actually still have a small apartment here that I'm just got back to a couple of days ago from Anchorage, Alaska, which is my primary residence now. And it is really great to be in Pittsburgh and to hear the continued efforts of people like yourselves to go and improve air pollution. I've lived in many places since I got involved in air pollution in the 1960s. And Pittsburgh is, as far as I'm concerned, the best in terms of group like Asthma and other groups that have come together to make a difference. And you clearly have made a difference. Okay, so I want to talk about something that basically comes out of the science and has been overlooked as we set our last two standards, the particulate and ozone standards set under the previous administration. Just as a little background, and again, for people to have it if they want to keep it, we've got a Clean Air Act, which in 1970 told us that we need to set, so for selected air pollutants, we needed to set standards that we need to keep to. And we should reevaluate them every 5 years or sooner. That is really one of the most powerful movers of getting more stringent standards, because it has really forced the research and forced us to look more closely at the whole issue. But the language specifies that the standard must protect public health with an adequate margin of safety. And I'm going to talk about the margin of safety in relation to COVID-19 and in relation to, if you will, a potential policy initiative. The focus is on sensitive populations, not the most sensitive individuals. So it's certainly asthmatics for both ozone and particulates, but it's not the most sensitive asthmatic for how we set the standard. EPA is required to form a bunch of scientists to get together, a Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, and I chaired that in the early 1980s, I think. And it basically has the duty of looking at the research that's been done about the individual pollutant under consideration, and looking at what EPA has done to evaluate this pollutant, and to come up with a recommendation to the administrators to what the standard ought to be. And in the past, and sometimes now, what we've done is given a range of numbers. So we'll say to the administrator, Madam Administrator, a reasonable scientist would think that the standard should be somewhere between 8 and 10 parts per billion, 1 hour, et cetera. We remind you, however, that at 10, at that upper level, there is no margin of safety. And so let me go into this margin of safety, because that's, to me, the key issue of that I'm going to be focusing on in this time of COVID. The standard that the activity that CASAC does is very rigorously science-based. It's a very thorough evaluation of each paper, and now thousands of papers, where it used to be tens or hundreds, as I say, when I was involved with it, and trying to come out with what is the best estimate we can come up with in keeping with the requirements of CASAC. But the margin of safety is not determined by CASAC. CASAC is a very science-oriented, rigorous science. The margin of safety is determined at the discretion of the EPA administrator. Well, doesn't have to give any at all. If it was just that, but Congress said, no, wait a second. We're going to put into the language of the Clean Air Act a whole series of specific guidances to the administrator as to what should be taken into account. And what I've done here is I've put in quotes what's actually in the language of the Clean Air Act, and highlighted some of my comments. So the congressional language justifying adding a margin of safety is to, quote, address uncertainties associated with inconclusive scientific and technical information, which goes beyond the charge to CASAC, which is to be rigorous scientists. It's to provide a reasonable degree of protection against hazards that research has not yet identified. And the EPA administrator should set the margin of safety even if, quote, the risk is not precisely identified as to nature, which is the hazard, or degree, which is, if you will, the dose response part of our usual risk assessment. The hazards, the intrinsic property of a chemical to cause an effect. Benzene causes leukemia, that's its hazard. And Congress even went beyond that. It gave instructions about what the administrator should consider in setting a margin of safety. It's the nature and severity of the effect. There's a rare inherited disorder. A couple hundred kids each year are born with it. They'll die before they're 3 years old. Any bit of sulfur will make them sicker. You don't set a standard based upon that size of the sensitive population. The severity of the effect is there, but the size of the sensitive population is also important. And the difference would be perhaps the child would live a month longer if we abolished all sulfur in the air. It's the kind and degree of uncertainties that are also important. So what about that? Particulates in ozone produce lung and heart disease. So does COVID-19. Particulates in probably ozone cause increased mortality in those with pre-existing heart and lung disease. So does COVID-19. On that alone, I mean, the medical science technical term for asking for an answer to the question of is if something affects any organ in the body and something else comes along and it affects that same organ, will there be an additional to these two effects? Will they at least add together, if not cause a synergistic effect? The answer to that, they say, scientific technical term is no-brainer, of course. There's no question whatsoever that one would expect that COVID-19 and these air pollutions would do something which will affect the pollutant. And the particulates in ozone cause the increased mortality in ways that are particularly worrisome that in relation to COVID-19. Anybody with any pre-existing lung disease, for almost any reason you can think of, will be more at risk for COVID-19. Anyone with pre-existing lung disease will also be more at risk for sulfur dioxide to any of the air pollutants that affect the lung. And that's clear in the literature. That there's no debate about. The question is how much, and how much do you add a margin of safety for it? The size of the sensitive population. Well, most of the population is at risk for COVID-19. The risk of mortality is higher in those with pre-existing lung disease. And as I said, that can also be caused by ozone and particulate matter. So you can read through this and see the issues that are there. We know also with COVID-19 that there is a loss of lung function that persists for at least as long as we've known COVID-19 to be around in the long haul cases. And that these are occurring even in people who do not get hospitalized, who do not seem to be seriously ill. There seems to be scarring of the lung. Now, a little bit of minor scarring of the lung isn't that important until you get to my age and you're in a situation in which just a little bit more can make things a lot worse. And rather than just being something that lays you low for a while, it's something that kills you. And this is, again, sort of obvious. The kind and degree of uncertainty is also, again, in quotes because it's in the congressional language. And again, it's this susceptibility that's known to work together. So did Administrator Wheeler in the Trump administration include COVID-19 in the margin of safety for particulates or for ozone? And the answer is no. I mean, the only mention of COVID-19 in the Federal Register notice setting these two standards last year was the rationale given for, sorry, you can't go walk into EPA and look at this in our docket office because we've had to close the docket office. Now, this is the same administrator who basically said EPA is not going to do as much oversight of polluting industries because of COVID-19. We don't want anyone to get sick during this oversight. So they're clearly aware of it. What reason was given for this? Well, the reason somehow didn't get in here, but it's in the language of responding to those of us who wrote in official language that needs to be responded to as part of setting a standard. the administrator basically said, well, we're not really sure about a lot of the issues related to how you define COVID-19, how many cases there have been, and things to which there's a lot of truth to, but it has nothing to do with the margin of safety considerations. It does have to do, these kind of lack of certainties, do have to do with the extent to which we can pinpoint the level of pollutant that's going to interact with COVID-19 and how much it interacts, but not whether it will interact, not whether it should be considered in the margin of safety. So there is, since the last administrator has stepped down, fortunately, we have a new administration. We also have a resurgence of COVID-19. We have the opportunity to be able to say, well, look, a margin of safety of COVID-19 was not considered in the margin of safety. We ought to be considering it now. And when we consider it, we, again, don't need to bring it back to CASAC. We don't need to go through the very long, detailed effort that EPA's Office of Research and Development does in coming up and reviewing all of the science. And Matt did mention, but I was the assistant administrator at EPA in charge of research and development after I chaired CASAC. So it's a very strenuous and stringent process for CASAC to review all that literature and come up with a scientific determination. But the Clean Air Act allows you to go beyond that. And COVID-19, I think, is the perfect opportunity to basically get the more stringent air pollution standards, not on a national level, that we should have received had the last administration been dealing with this fairly. So with that, again, let me thank you all and look forward to your comments.